You ready to jump to your second question here?
Yeah. Are there any growth tactics that kind of helps you kickstart this creator career that you have, especially at the beginning? Feels like nothing's really working. And then curious if it was more of a steady, consistent climb, or if there were moments when you're like, wow, this really worked. And now I finally found something that can really help me from this seed that I planted. Was there ever that moment, or was it just a consistent effort?
I would say a combination of the two. So I would say that, and it's funny because it depends how you look at it, right? So on a macro level, if you zoom way out, I could go, yeah, it was this steady climb. But on a micro level of a few months, a year, maybe even a few years, it wasn't necessarily always going up and to the right. Very sort of plateau and, oh, maybe this is a thing. Because the other thing you have to keep in mind is there's so many moving parts with this. So me or you or whoever it is, you're figuring out how to do this and what you like to do and what you want to do and how you can do it best. But simultaneously, your interests are evolving and experiences are evolving in your own life, which influences this. The platform, the audience, the things the world wants in general are evolving. So you have all these moving targets, right? It's not like the playing field is static and you just have to figure out how to win the game. Everything is constantly in motion. And sometimes those things will line up perfectly and a lot of times they won't. And sometimes they'll be lined up perfectly, but then the game tilts and all of a sudden, and you see this all the time with platforms, right? You see these people who maybe had built a huge following on Vine and they think they cracked the code and then Vine disappears, that kind of thing. But I think in general, and I'm going to give you some specific growth tactics that I used at the end. I think it's important to talk about it a little more broadly because it's going to be different. People are going to try to grow different things. Two big things are consistency and focus. So consistency, and I learned both of these the hard way, but these are the two levers that when I honed in on consistency and focus, that in general has tended to sort of fuel my growth. In the beginning, I used to start and stop stuff all the time. I'd start a blog, I'd run it for 3 months, 6 months, maybe a year. Then I get another idea and I'd scrap that one. And I'd start another one. I'd start a newsletter. I'd get rid of it. Literally, I can't even count how many times I did that and all different niches and different stuff, which is fine because I do think it's part of the process of finding your way. But, every once in a while I would think about, wow, if I would have just been doing the same thing from the start, which is completely unrealistic. Like it's not a regret, but that stop and start, I was basically starting over every time just with a new set of knowledge and experience. So finding something that I could do consistently. My newsletter really took off when I started, I've stuck with it now for 6 years and as opposed to stopping and starting new ones and all that kind of stuff. That's the first thing. The second thing is focus. I think focus is really important and not just in a way of like a deep work focus. I don't mean that, but I mean focus on what you're actually doing and where you're investing your time and resources. And the perfect example of this for me is Twitter. I used Twitter for years. I think I was first on it in like 2008. I was using it. A lot of people do post whatever. And I really wasn't all that strategic about it. And it wasn't really growing. And I was using Facebook and I was using Instagram and I was using whatever. And all of them were doing okay, but none of it was really growing. A few years ago, I decided to only use Twitter. That's what I mean by focus. As soon as I said, I'm going to invest, instead of spreading my social media time across multiple platforms, I'm going to invest all that time in one platform, which is going to allow me to engage with more people, to put more time into that content, to understand that platform. And as soon as I did, that's when my Twitter following started to take off. Strongly recommend that for people starting out and honestly, even established people. One platform. You will grow faster investing your time in one social platform than you will spreading it across multiple social platforms. And see, those two factors, consistency and focus, are really crucial. And most of the people that I talk to who are struggling, it's usually because they're having a problem with one of those two things, right? And I actually have a blog post that sort of talks about this in a slightly different way, and we'll link it in the show notes. But basically, I've found that if your audience isn't growing, it's either because you're not doing enough or you're doing too much. almost always. And that's a different version of consistency and focus. It's kind of the same thing. Some people are going, I don't know why this isn't growing. Or they go, I don't know why my newsletter is not growing or my podcast isn't growing. And I'll look at them and I go, well, you put out one episode every 6 months. So how's it going to grow? You're not doing enough. And other people will go, I don't know why my Instagram account isn't growing. And I'll look at it and I'll go, well, you're spending all your time on Twitter and YouTube. You're doing 8 million things and ignoring people that are replying to your Instagram posts. To do less and focus, and then it will grow. What's interesting is when I ask people this, and I'm going to put you on the spot and I'm going to ask you this now.
Yeah.
Most people, when I ask them, do you think you're doing too much? Or do you think you're doing not enough or too much? What would you say?
So this is a really interesting question for me because I have a couple of different businesses that I'm running on top of this. And so I'm trying to juggle managing my teams and growing this business, or I guess just building an audience in general. I feel like I'm doing too much, yet not enough. It's like a weird thing where it
Well, so you're saying you feel like you're doing too much overall, counting the other businesses you're running. But when it comes to just if you were looking at the creator side in a vacuum, would you say you're doing too much or not enough?
So my focus right now for social platform, I've chosen Twitter and LinkedIn. And so perhaps I should just pare that down to one. And then on the content side, so I have this podcast, which I'm consistently putting out each week. And that takes up a lot of time. But then I'm actually trying to create a newsletter now. And that's been on my mind for 2023. I'm like, okay, I got to start a newsletter because, you know, I've heard a lot of synergy between podcast and newsletter. And so I'm kind of, that's in the back of my mind as I'm starting this year. And I feel really overwhelmed with finally getting this podcast going consistently. But then now I'm trying to add this new thing in there. Yeah. I mean, I just feel like maybe I should just pare it down and not even worry about the newsletter for now and just focus on the podcast.
I'll give you a few suggestions. And first of all, I'm biased because I think everyone should have a newsletter. I think it's like crucially important and the best connection you can have to people. My newsletter is the biggest driver of traffic to my podcast by far, not even close. I'm very much pro newsletter, but a couple things. One is I think a good exercise to do for everyone, by the way, even if you don't think you're doing too much, is to look at what you're doing and say, okay, if I had to stop doing 10% or 20% of what I'm doing, had to get the same results I'm currently getting, what would I stop? Because I think even if you don't do it, it's a really helpful exercise to go through, because I think a lot of times when people are looking at stuff, they're looking at it and going, I do this thing, do I need to do it? And they go, yeah, I need to do it. But when you shift the question to, if I had to get rid of something, what is the least helpful versus is this helpful? Shifts the whole mindset. So that's a good exercise to do. The next thing I would say is, it's interesting. You mentioned like synergy between newsletter and podcast, but there's also synergy between newsletter and your social channels or whatever. The way I like to think about it is and everyone has their own system for creating and distributing content, but all of these things are just distribution outlets essentially for ideas that you have and want to put in the world. An episode of your podcast could easily be a bunch of tweets, could easily be your newsletter. And this is the other thing. People have assumptions about what a newsletter is, that it involves a lot of extra work, and that couldn't be further from the truth. My daily newsletter is like a sentence. And by the way, people love it. People love, as long as it's valuable, right? All you have to do is send them something valuable. So for you, and I'm not saying this is what it should be, but just as an example, your newsletter could be, here's the best 30 seconds of this podcast episode. And here's a link to an article, a resource, a video, something else that relates to that topic. And that's it. If you're doing that as your newsletter, that's not adding that much more work.
Right.
Yes, it's still some more work, but it's not adding that much more work. And it's valuable. So I think that's a key piece of this sort of content overwhelm part. A key piece of it is understanding how to maximize and get more and repurpose the stuff that you're doing. This conversation we're having right now is a little bit of an example. We were on Twitter and had a little exchange. I could have replied to you. We could have had that Twitter exchange and it could have been done. Instead, I'm like, you know what? Let's record this conversation. And this will become content that goes on my podcast, goes on YouTube, goes on Twitter, etc. So I think that's definitely a piece of it. So just before we move on to the next question, I do want to give you some specific growth tactics beyond the sort of overall mindset that worked for me. So my main thing is my newsletter. So I'll kind of speak to how that grew. My newsletter grew primarily from original content. I think original content is the best way for most things to grow. And with consistency, I wrote a blog post every week. I wrote a newsletter every week, and then I would tweet daily as time went on. That original stuff and all of it was designed. It's funny. I had a realization recently, which I think I've always operated this way, but hadn't really thought about it, that my blog post actually exists to grow my newsletter. That's why, I started being like, well, why am I actually writing these blog posts? What do I want to, yes, I want to help people and I want them to read it and I want them to get something of it. But when I started to realize the point of the blog post is to grow the newsletter, that's the sort of key metric, the center of my universe. Then it's obvious to in your newsletter, which again, I would promote my newsletter in there anyway, but it was interesting, my mindset of this exists to convince someone, to attract and convince someone who's going to find value in my newsletter. A few years ago, not as much anymore, but I used to syndicate my articles to Medium. I would literally just copy and paste them and publish them on Medium. I got a lot of subscribers from that. I'd plug my newsletter in it. I used to get a lot more traffic there. I feel like Medium's audience has gone down significantly. I still do it, but I don't get nearly the traction that I used to. In the early days, I ran Facebook ads to promote my newsletter. So I'd spent some money on that. And again, a lot of experimentation to get to the point where I got ads that were working pretty well. So I definitely did some of that. Cross promotions as time went on and I started to develop relationships with people. Cross promotions with other newsletters worked really well. And then and this is more in recent years, but newsletter ads I found worked really well for me and were pretty cost effective. But again, it always evolves. I ran a bunch of Facebook ads early on. I don't run any now. I don't think that I really would. Medium was really good early on. Doesn't really get me much now. So I think that's the other thing is, again, this moving target, everything evolves. What works for me won't necessarily work for others. You kind of got to find your own way because there's a lot of variables.